This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publications. And here is your host, researcher and entrepreneur, Olli Tikkanen.
Welcome everyone. As a listener of this podcast, you probably know very well the importance of being active throughout the day. The challenge is just how to actually get it done in a busy daily life, and a static standing has also its own downsides. There might be a solution for you, a treadmill desk from Germany called Walkalution. What is a treadmill desk? In short, a workstation that allows you to walk slowly while you work at your desk. But in Walkalution's case, it is treadmill without the motor, so it's silent and you decide the speed as you are the engine of the treadmill. It also has sliding integrated desk and backrest, so you can have several different postures and can avoid overloading parts of the body for extended periods of time. At least for me, different activities and postures just fit better with certain work tasks, and Walkalution enables natural flow between postures. I've been testing the treadmill myself and it simply delivers. Every detail is thought through. So I'm glad as we can now offer Walkalution desk treadmill for the listeners of this podcast with 10% discount. To get the discount, use the code SITLESS, one word written together, in the store of walkalution.com. That is written walk as in walking and illusion like the second part of revolution or evolution. And now it's time for the introduction of the guest of today's episode. I'm very excited about the forthcoming episode as we are going to be talking about measurement of physical activity, differences between evaluation and research, and whether we should focus our research locally or globally, and also whether we should be more positive in our research communication. We will also touch upon the importance of teaching in academia. Our guest has done his PhD at University of Oxford about the validity and reliability of self-reported travel behaviour. Currently, he is working as a reader in physical activity for health at the University of Edinburgh. Ladies and gentlemen, I am honoured to introduce our guest, Dr. Paul Kelly. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks for having me, Olli.
Yeah, great to have you. I noticed that in your Twitter handle you have narrowboat Paul. Could you tell listeners that a bit about narrowboats and how fast they actually go?
I'm very happy to try it. So a narrowboat gets its name because it's only, I guess, about 8 or so feet wide, and it navigates on the canals, sort of the human-built waterways that we have across the UK, but of course in Europe and other parts of the world as well. And traditionally for moving cargo and industrial revolution kind of drive. But these days they've become kind of recreational ways that we have our holidays. So we walk around, and they're about 3 miles per hour if you walk alongside the narrowboat, and then every mile or so you jump off and have play with a lock and help the boat rise up and down to go over a hill or something. And yeah, it's just a wonderful way to spend your leisure time. So I strongly recommend, if you ever get the opportunity, to have a look at that.
Yeah. When I was staying in UK, I saw quite a lot of those in Wales, and I was in place. I don't really know how to pronounce it in Welsh, but Llangollen, and they have this bridge, and you don't go under that bridge with the boat, but you go on the bridge. So it's a big bridge, and you can go over. And I thought that's amazing place.
Yes, this is a very famous bridge you describe, and it's spectacular. And yes, if for any of your listeners who have an opportunity to visit, I highly recommend.
Yeah, perfect way to relax going 3 miles per hour on a canal. So if we move to your personal and professional background, how did you come to this point, and how did you move from travel behavior to physical activity?
Sure. So I guess I'm a physiologist by training. I did my master's in physiology, sports physiology. But towards the end of the course, had a lecture from Dr. Charlie Foster, who kind of encouraged us to think about the population benefits of sport and activity as opposed to the performance side we'd been looking at, and this was kind of my first steps into physical activity and public health research, and did my dissertation with Charlie and ultimately my PhD. And we ended up doing a project looking at measurement of, I think, as you mentioned in the introduction, how good are self-reported diaries or travel logs,
Mm,
indeed, for walking and cycling, and yeah, it was this kind of looking at measurement in great detail and coming to try and understand some of the strengths and limitations and challenges that has really led me, to focus now on things like evaluation, which can rely heavily on measurement, and also, lots of the science that we do, certainly the quantitative science, relies on measurement in some way. So, it's kind of been a really nice avenue into multiple different kind of study designs and areas of research.
mm. And you said about evaluation and research. How do you define the two? What is the actual difference between evaluation and research?
It's a good question, Ollie, and I've got to be careful because my definition, may not be the right one, and may disagree with, your listeners and other people. For me, research is quite tightly bound by theoretical constraints or theoretical considerations, and might be bound by the paradigm and certain methods, and we might immediately think of the the hierarchy of evidence from evidence-based medicine, and privileging certain study designs or study types over others. Whereas I think evaluation is much more focused on the real world. Decisions have to be made regardless of whether the perfect study design is possible, and
Mm,
therefore, we have to be far more flexible in our approaches to what we can learn about the world, and what we can learn about policy and health promotion, to try and at least offer some useful evidence for the next round of decisions or decision making. So, um, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it goes some way to kind of outlining how I might see the two as not being exactly the same thing.
yeah, I get your point. And and as you wanted to bring this up, do you see that it's important to distinct the two? And are we going wrong way sometimes when we mix those two?
I think it's absolutely crucial to think about the difference between the two. And the reason for that is because I think the words research and evaluation encode so much information. And we have to understand that if we choose to use one or other word, the person who hears that is going to make a ton of assumptions and extrapolations on what we might be talking about, what we might be planning to do. So, if you are talking to a policymaker, or if you are talking to a practitioner, or if you are talking to a academic, I think it's really important to think, how are they going to understand my meaning when I choose to use one word or the other? You don't have to necessarily agree with their meaning, but I do think you have to understand the implications of using either word in your translation and in your communication.
Mm. And when you are doing your studies, are you doing more evaluations or are you doing more research?
I think, on balance, it's probably half and half. We do lots of what I might call classical research in our institute, in our research center, and more often than not, when we're working with students, that's much more in a research paradigm, in terms of their training and their development. But as soon as we start working with organizations that are doing health promotion in the real world, whether that's the health service, whether that's local government, or whether that's charities in the third sector, I think we're very quickly starting to talk about evaluation type work, due to the nature of trying to do things in the real world with real world constraints and realities.
And if we go a little bit more to the methods, you have been teaching the physical activity measurement classes, for example. Why is measuring physical activity so hard?
It's an excellent question, Ollie. I think it's because physical activity is such a complex set of behaviors, that range from walking to gardening to yoga to what we do in the workplace to what we don't do in the workplace or at home, and that they can be looked at in terms of so many dimensions. The classic ones are the fit dimensions: frequency, intensity, time, and type. But we've also got questions about why someone's doing it, how it makes them feel, what was their motivation, what were the barriers and facilitators, the fact that intensity could be considered as relative or absolute. So there's all of these considerations, and then we say, right, I want to measure that, but I need to do a survey, and I'm only allowed one question. So I think we often set ourselves up to make the challenge far too hard by thinking that it will be straightforward. Well, I'll just pick one device, or I'll just pick one questionnaire that can do all of these things, and of course, I don't think they can. So I think measurement is hard because we maybe try to do too much, with too few resources most of the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you have been doing some studies related to self-reported physical activity. Could you tell more about those studies?
Sure. So I guess it starts with my PhD, which we're going back, goodness, over 10 years now. And we had started to collaborate with Microsoft Research, and they had developed a device that they called SenseCam. And SenseCam was a small camera that you wore around your neck, and it took a photograph approximately every 10 or 15 seconds. Now, what made it interesting at the time, going all that way back, was that it could store in excess of 10,000 images, and it had a battery life of 18 hours or so, which meant you could capture a person's entire day in 15-second increments of images. And that gave you a really good idea of what they were doing. Were they watching telly? Were they working? Were they cycling? Were they walking? All these things. And my sense was that kind of gave us an opportunity to do a genuinely objective measurement of behavior. Um, so we asked people to wear these devices for 1 or 2 or 3 days, and also to fill out various self-reported measures. And if I'm honest, the goal at the time was to show how bad self-reported measures were. And we'd say, look, here's the size of the error. So either you can do an adjustment, or you should say we shouldn't use it at all. And that would kind of solve all problems of measurement. So it was a reasonably ambitious PhD, and arguably overly ambitious. But to my surprise, what we found was that, on average, if you asked 300 people to fill out a travel diary, and then you looked at their images, you found that it was really good. If the average was 27 minutes a day of walking, the images would say something like 26 and a half minutes. So, a 30-second error or so that, is entirely acceptable for our scientific purposes. Also, interestingly, it showed that there was huge individual variation. So, if I asked you to fill out a travel diary, Ollie, you might overestimate the first walk of the day by 20 minutes, underestimate the next one by 15, and forget about the third one. So what it looked like was that self-reports was going to be really problematic to measure individual level behavior and detect change at the level of the individual, which is often what we need to do in intervention. But that it was going to be really good for classifying, large groups of people in, for example, surveillance or trend monitoring, or indeed in, the sort of cohort studies where we try and assess risk, relative risk for various outcomes. So that was really interesting. And kind of the second thing that was really interesting was learning that there is no such thing as an objective measure. Even with these images, I was having to make decisions about, well, when did it really start? And well, that person left the house to go walking, but they turned around to go and, they'd forgotten their coat or their keys or something. So do I add on the first 60 seconds, the first 3 minutes? They've stopped and they've started talking to someone in the street. Are they still out walking? Should I take that time away for my objective assessment or not? So even though I thought it was entirely objective, with the best will in the world, there was still lots of researcher decisions that had to be made, and I found that super interesting as well. That we probably set our expectations too high of ever really knowing the truth about how much activity various people are doing.
And you said that it was surprisingly good for travel behavior. Did you also measure some other physical activities, like if you, for example, think about moving around the house, which is probably more difficult to remember than cycling to work? Did you look at the other activities at all?
Well, I didn't, Ollie. I have to be honest that I intended to, but by the time I'd done all this work on active travel and thinking about validity and reliability, my PhD was over. So I had to really scale back my plans there. But a group that we collaborated with who worked in time use research did exactly this. So there's time use diaries are kind of these 24-hour logs where you record everything you do in 5 or 10 or 15-minute increments through the day. And they did exactly this. They repeated the study design with these time use diaries, and again found similar findings, that the self-report measures were performing far better than expected when it came to classifying, as you say, these activities of daily living. And I think the other really important point there is, self-report often gets kind of lumped in as a single method, but you've got diaries, you've got travel logs, you've got interviews, you've got questionnaires, and some of them perform better than others in different circumstances. And again, I think that's one of the reasons we find measurement of physical activity so challenging, is because we don't have necessarily a really good taxonomy or systematic map of the differences and the strengths and limitations of all the various options.
Yeah. And you said that it's surprisingly good, the self-report. Do you think we should combine the self-report with the so-called objective measurement methods when we want to get the best possible results?
I think it depends what you want to know, Ollie. There are times when a combination of self-report and devices will give you excellent information. There are other times when it's unnecessary and all you're doing is increasing participant burden and probably increasing data loss and dropout because of the protocol you're asking people to follow. I think there's huge opportunities for good combination in validation studies or in subsamples of our research to validate a small sample of a larger group. And I think there are certain research questions where a combination of, I don't know, let's say step count or GPS tracking would be an excellent in combination with self-reported data about reason or for the activity, or indeed the purpose. Was it part of travel? Was it part of work? Was it part of leisure? So I think we could be doing a better job on those combinations. But to go back to your earlier question, very few evaluations that I've been involved with would have the budget to do such a thing. So I think we have to also understand that such combinations are at the moment likely to be limited to well-funded, academic research studies.
Let's have a short break into interview and think about the way we work. You might be walking or going about your daily course when listening to this podcast episode. But when working on a computer, we are easily stuck to static positions, whether sitting or standing. Wouldn't it be nice if you could take steps as you like? There might be a solution for you. A treadmill desk from Germany called Walkolution. Treadmill has curved shape and is powered only by you, so it moves in perfect sync with your rhythm. It features sliding integrated desk and backrest, so you can keep switching between postures easily throughout the day. It makes knowledge work much better suited for our physiology, so I'm delighted as we can now offer Walkaloosan desk treadmill for the listeners of this podcast with 10% discount. To get the discount, use code SITLESS, one word written together, in the store of walkaloosan.com. That is written walk as in walking and allusion like the second part of revolution or evolution. So walkaloosan.com, check it out, and let's continue with the interview. And what kind of self-reports you would recommend for different kind of situation? Which ones do work the best if you need to do kind of large-scale evaluation, for example? Which method should you use?
Good question. And, the decision would depend on the study design, the study question. So I think those two things need to be first and foremost in the decision making. But then I would recommend shorter is better. The more questions you ask, the fewer people will fill it in. And I think having a really good consideration of the delivery format. So is it appropriate to do this online? Is pen and paper appropriate? Is over the phone the best option for your target group? And that might depend on age or setting or something like that. And also, giving really good consideration to the wording in the questions. So often, and I think of myself first in this criticism. We use wording that makes sense to researchers, and we use technical things like moderate to vigorous and aerobic, and words which I think are far less well understood, quite rightly, by the general population. And so I think thinking about self-report measures that use relatable and appropriate terminology and language is really important as well.
Mm. And if we go to these wearable cameras you mentioned that you have used, how widely they are used in physical activity research at the moment?
Well, I don't think they're used very much at the moment, Ollie. Like I say, the 10, 12 years ago when they came out, the technology, made them very unique. But these days, everyone has a mobile phone in their pocket, which kind of has many of the same capabilities in terms of image storage and battery life. And also when this research was done was kind of prior to lots of consideration about digital privacy and how much our images are shared on social media and permission for things like this. And I actually think the research would be much harder to do now for those reasons. If you walked around your local station or airport or shopping center with a wearable camera, I think you quite rightly might receive some questions from either the staff or members of the public. So, for a number of reasons, these cameras are not currently really part of the conversation. But I think what's useful is the learning that we gained from them. Like I say, both in terms of how self-report performs when you make these comparisons, and also some of the kind of thinking and philosophy around what do we genuinely mean by a gold standard or a criterion measure, and can we ever actually know the full truth about an individual's physical activity behavior?
And yeah, I think I have seen some startup doing a camera which is doing exactly the same. I think it's in the necklace or something, and normal people can buy it, but I think the first group they were targeting people with memory problems. So actually they can how boost their memory that they actually see images that what has happened to their in their life, especially if you have like short-term memory problems. So you can see those. And you have also done some work on the ethics of the wearable cameras. Could you tell more about that work?
Absolutely. I mean, when we were doing the research, it was, and we, quite rightly, as we were designing it and planning it, started to seek ethical approval. We realized that there was a bit of a gap, certainly in terms of physical activity and health behavior research in terms of the considerations that were important when if you wanted to do this image capture, because importantly, if you ask someone to wear a camera, you collect far fewer images of them than you do of the people that they encounter during the day. And that kind of raises questions about, the participant in some ways becoming the researcher, or an extension of the researcher and generating their own data, rather than simply, responding to, the researcher's protocol or requests. So it raised lots of questions around, I guess, second and third party consent, autonomy, agency, privacy. We had to do lots of really rigorous protocols on how the images were stored and how they were encrypted in case the camera got left on a bus or something. And we had to give people full agency to delete images. If they left the camera on and went to the bathroom, or they had the camera in the house and they captured an image of their partner or child that they didn't want recorded or added to the research database. So we had to put lots of protocols in place to allow them to delete these images indefinitely. And of course, we had to come up with really good informed consent materials so that when people were making the decision about whether or not to take part, they were fully informed about the potential risks and the and how these were going to be mitigated in the study. And it's all well and good writing a 5,000-word academic paper on ethics, as we did, but that was not going to be any use to a normal member of the public in deciding whether or not they wished to take part. So creating materials that summarize these things effectively, but in a format that was readable, was quite important, or very important as well. So there were many considerations that were really helpful learning for me, during my PhD, in terms of the ethics of research, and hopefully, as you said, these cameras were used beyond physical activity research, and indeed, there were applications before we started using them in memory, like you said. But it does seem that the ethical paper we wrote has been kind of one of the most helpful ones to the wider field in terms of doing research that adhered to best practice principles.
Yeah, so probably wearable cameras for physical activity research could be used in the validation studies like you used, but probably not for other things that it's ethically a little bit challenging.
That's largely the conclusion we came to. Really, really effective validation tool, unlikely to be something that could ever be administered at scale. One of the reasons is, so for my final PhD study, I think I had approximately 300 participants who wore the device for 3 or 4 days. I ended up with about 3.5 million images, which I needed to click through and code. And it took about 4 months. So, that automatically just puts a cap or a limitation on the number of applications where they could be used as the primary data collection tool. But as you say, using them as a validation tool, if you have the time and you have the kind of researcher capacity to do all that coding and that, I still think they have utility there, and there are groups still using them. Things developed, and halfway through the work, I think the first GoPro came out, can take video while people cycle and run, and you can put it on your dog and things like this. And the technology did develop very quickly, and there's still people who are doing excellent science with video recording now, and ride-alongs and walk-alongs and citizen science and stuff. So the field has naturally evolved, and I think while the specific device that we used is kind of now a historical piece, some of the principles and validation principles, I think, have continued to be helpful.
And do you think you could actually direct the camera differently and position the camera differently? I'm thinking maybe if you could put it pointing downwards towards your feet, and you would have it, for example, somewhere on the knee level, and it would just be pointing down. So you would actually see that, are the legs just relaxing when you're sitting down, or are you walking, or are you on the bike? Have you considered this kind of different direction for the camera?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think we'd considered that specific suggestion. And as you say, if the camera pointed down, you could get probably more private information, as in, less information about the third parties, but just about the participant, about their ambulation, about their walking and their sitting. You'd of course lose information about their screen time, for example, and anything that might involve upper body activity. So depending on what you wanted to know, I think that could be a nice solution. And other things that were discussed were, could you put the camera on top of someone's television set at home so that you could get a sense of how much time people spend sitting in front of the TV on a daily basis. But then, smartphones came along and laptops. People started watching television on their laptops, and the kind of idea of traditionally the family sitting in front of the TV suggested that you'd need cameras everywhere in the house, and maybe very few families would sign up to such a protocol, of course. So I think there do remain some really great applications for different research designs, and each one kind of every new thing you try solves one problem, but probably creates another one that you need to balance up and decide what's the best approach overall.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think like nowadays when you buy a new smartphone, it probably has like 7 cameras inside it, and you can buy it with €200. So the technology have gone so far that you could have small cameras pointing maybe directed exactly for example, to your hand, that is there a smartphone in the hand, and maybe in a way that you wouldn't see other things from it. So I'm just trying to think that could you use this with the new technology, but probably at the moment, at least, that would still be a little bit too complicated.
Maybe one day in the future, Ollie. It's I wouldn't be amazed, but yeah, I think it might be a little while away yet.
Thanks for joining us this week on Physical Activity Researcher Podcast. If you like the show, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing or following the show on Twitter. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. If you found value in the show, we would really appreciate a rating on Apple Podcast or whichever app you're using. Or if you would, in a real old school way, simply tell a friend about the show. It would be a great help for us. We have a fantastic lineup of guests for forthcoming episodes, so be sure to tune in. Thank you all for your support and have a great day.